The blood-red sunset painted the horizon as Quentin Crawford slumped against the weathered post of Dawson Creek's only saloon, his eyes as empty as the whiskey bottle dangling from his calloused fingers. The townsfolk called him the Ghost these days, not for any prowess with his Colt revolver, but for the hollow man he'd become since burying his wife and infant son 3 winters past. "Pour another," Quentin muttered to the barkeep as he shuffled back inside, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath his spurred boots. His once proud shoulders now carried the invisible weight of a man who'd lost everything worth fighting for. At 32, his face had weathered beyond his years, deep lines etched around eyes that rarely looked directly at another person anymore. "Think you've had enough, Crawford," replied Sam Jenkins, the aging bartender who'd watched Quentin's descent with growing concern. "Sun's barely down, and you're already 3 sheets to the wind." Quentin's hand instinctively moved toward the revolver on his hip, then fell away. There was a time when such an insult might have ended with blood on the floor. Now, he simply lacked the fire to care. "My money's still good here, ain't it?" he growled, tossing a coin onto the counter. Sam shook his head but poured another drink. "Last one. Then I want you gone before the evening crowd arrives. Bad for business having you haunting the place." The year was 1878, and Dawson Creek, Colorado, was changing. The railroad had come through last spring, bringing with it an influx of new settlers, merchants, farmers, and families looking to build something permanent. The wild, lawless days were fading, but men like Quentin remained relics of a harder time, unable or unwilling to change with the world around them. "He used to be something, you know," whispered a young cowhand to his companion at a nearby table. "Heard he once took down the entire Murphy gang single-handed up near Silver Ridge." "That ain't nothing but talk," his friend replied. "Look at him now, just another drunk waiting to die." Quentin heard them but gave no indication. Let them talk. The legends, the reputation, none of it mattered anymore. Not since that terrible night when raiders had attacked his homestead while he was away driving cattle. By the time he returned, there was nothing left but ashes, 2 fresh graves, and a void inside him no amount of whiskey could fill. The saloon doors swung open, bringing with them a gust of autumn air and the sound of wagon wheels outside. Sam's face brightened at the newcomers' potential customers with money to spend and no dark clouds hanging over them. "Crawford," Sam hissed, "I meant what I said. Finish up and get out." Quentin knocked back his drink and rose unsteadily. As he turned to leave, he collided with a woman entering the establishment, nearly sending them both sprawling. "Beg your pardon, madam," he mumbled, steadying himself against a chair. When he looked up, the world seemed to slow. She wasn't dressed like the saloon girls or the wives of ranchers. Her traveling dress was simple but well made, and though dusty from the road, spoke of Eastern refinement. Her chestnut hair was pinned up beneath a modest hat, with a few strands escaping to frame a face that struck him with its quiet determination. "No harm done," she replied, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't place. Her eyes, a striking hazel, assessed him briefly before moving past to survey the saloon. "Sam Jenkins?" she called to the bartender. "That's me, miss. How can I help you?" "I'm Dahlia Hayes. I believe you received word about me? I've come to take over my uncle's property, the old Mercer place." Sam's face registered surprise. "You're Benjamin Mercer's niece. We weren't expecting a woman?" she finished for him, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Yes, I often have that effect. My uncle's letter stated the property was mine to claim if I arrived before the first snow." Quentin found himself rooted to the spot, unable to look away from this stranger who spoke with such confidence. It had been so long since anything had caught his interest that the feeling was almost painful, like blood returning to a numbed limb. "The Mercer place is no fit home for a lady," he found himself saying, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Been abandoned these past 5 years, probably nothing left but ruin and rattlesnakes." Dahlia turned to him, really seeing him for the first time. "And you are?" "Nobody worth knowing," Sam interjected. "Pay him no mind, Miss Hayes, he's just leaving." But Dahlia continued to regard Quentin with curiosity. "I don't believe I caught your name, sir." Crawford, he said gruffly. Quentin Crawford. A flicker of recognition crossed her face. The rancher? My uncle mentioned you in his letters. Said you helped him once when his wagon broke down in a storm. Quentin frowned, struggling to remember. So many memories were now buried beneath a fog of whiskey and grief. Might have. Don't recall. Well, Mr. Crawford, I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I assure you I'm quite capable of handling a few repairs and reptiles. She turned back to Sam. Now, about those keys my uncle left with you. Quentin should have left, then stumbled back to his ramshackle cabin on the edge of what remained of his ranch. Instead, he found himself lingering, watching as Sam produced a set of iron keys and a folded document from beneath the bar. The place is about 3 miles east of town, Sam explained. Not much to look at, I'm afraid. Your uncle wasn't much for upkeep even before he got sick and moved back east. I'm aware of the condition, Dahlia replied, tucking the keys into her reticule. I'll need supplies, lumber, nails, perhaps some help with the heavier work. Can you recommend anyone? Sam hesitated, glancing around the near-empty saloon. Most of the reliable men around here are busy with the harvest or fall roundup. Might have to wait a spell. I can't wait, she said firmly. Winter will be here before long, and I need to have the place habitable before then. Quentin felt the words forming in his throat, fought against them, and lost. I could take a look at it, he offered, surprising himself as much as the others. See what needs doing. Sam stared at him as if he'd grown a second head. Dahlia's expression was more measured, appraising. You're a builder, Mr. Crawford? Built my own place, before... He trailed off, unwilling to speak of what came after. I know my way around a hammer is all I'm saying. Dahlia studied him for a long moment, taking in his disheveled appearance, the stubble on his jaw, the haunted look that had become so familiar he no longer noticed it himself. Whatever she saw, it seemed to make up her mind. Very well, I accept your offer. When can you start? Sam cut in. Miss Hayes, I don't think tomorrow, Quentin interrupted. I'll meet you at the property at first light. She nodded. I'll be staying at the boarding house tonight. Mrs. Peterson's, I believe? Yes'm. Down the street, white house with blue shutters. Until tomorrow then, Mr. Crawford. She gathered her documents and turned to leave, then paused. And perhaps you might consider arriving less affected by spirits? The corner of Quentin's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but the closest thing to it he'd managed in years. I'll do my best, Miss Hayes. After she left, Sam leaned across the bar. What in tarnation was that about, Crawford? You haven't done an honest day's work in 3 years, and now you're volunteering to help some city woman fix up a homestead? Quentin didn't have an answer that made sense, even to himself. Something about Dahlia Hayes had cut through the haze he'd been living in, if only for a moment. Just figured I might as well do something useful for a change. Sam shook his head. Well, you better show up sober. That woman doesn't strike me as one who tolerates disappointment. Neither was Sarah, Quentin muttered, his late wife's name feeling strange on his lips after so long avoiding it. The mention of Sarah seemed to soften Sam's expression. Look, Quent, people round here, they've given up on you. Can't say I blame them. But if you're serious about helping Miss Hayes, maybe it's a start toward something better. Quentin grunted noncommittally and headed for the door. Outside, the last rays of sunlight had faded, leaving the main street bathed in the blue glow of twilight. He spotted Dahlia Hayes speaking with the livery owner, likely arranging transportation to her property tomorrow. Something stirred in his chest, unfamiliar, uncomfortable. It took him a moment to recognize it as purpose, a sensation he'd all but forgotten. That night, for the first time in years, Quentin Crawford didn't drink himself into oblivion. Instead, he sat on the porch of his neglected cabin, watching the stars emerge one by one, wondering what madness had possessed him to volunteer his services to a woman he'd just met, and why the prospect of seeing her again tomorrow made him both terrified and strangely alive. True to his word, Quentin arrived at the old Mercer place just as dawn was breaking over the eastern hills. He'd taken unusual care with his appearance, shaving his face clean, washing the trail dust from his clothes and leaving his ever-present bottle untouched on the shelf. His head ached from the absence of whiskey, but his eyes were clearer than they'd been in months. The Mercer homestead sat in a small valley, sheltered by cottonwoods along a creek that fed into the larger river beyond. Once, it might have been a promising piece of land, but years of neglect had taken their toll. The cabin's roof sagged dangerously, the corral fence had collapsed in several places, and weeds had overtaken what was once a garden. Quentin dismounted from his horse, surveying the property with a critical eye. It would take weeks of hard work to make it livable, even for someone accustomed to frontier conditions. For a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of an Eastern parlor, it seemed an impossible task. He was tying his horse to a surviving fence post when the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention. Dahlia Hayes rode toward him, sitting straight-backed on a chestnut mare, dressed in a practical riding habit that still managed to maintain a certain elegance. "Good morning, Mr. Crawford," she called as she approached. "I see you're a man of your word." "Morning, Miss Hayes." He touched the brim of his hat. "Been looking things over. Won't lie to you, place is in worse shape than I remembered." Dahlia dismounted with surprising grace, securing her horse beside his. "I expected as much. Uncle Benjamin was never one for practicalities." She turned to face the dilapidated cabin, her expression determined rather than discouraged. "Well, shall we assess the damage more thoroughly?" Together they approached the cabin. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, and when Quentin pushed it open, a family of mice scattered from their nest in the corner. Inside, the situation was grim. The roof had leaked in several places, leaving water damage to the floor and what little furniture remained. A thick layer of dust covered everything, and cobwebs stretched from the rafters like ghostly curtains. "The structure seems sound, at least," Dahlia observed, moving carefully through the main room. "The walls are still standing, and the chimney appears intact." Quentin nodded, surprised by her practical assessment. "Foundation's good. We'll need to replace most of the roof, fix these floorboards, and seal up those windows before winter hits. Stove's rusted through. You'll need a new one." "Make a list of what's required," she said, opening her satchel to retrieve a small notebook and pencil, which she handed to him. "I've brought funds to purchase necessary supplies." He accepted the notebook awkwardly, his calloused hands unused to such delicate tasks anymore. "How long you planning to stay out here, Miss Hayes? Because getting this place ready for winter is one thing, but making it proper comfortable is another matter entirely." Dahlia was examining the stone fireplace, running her fingers along the mantel. "I'm not planning to leave, Mr. Crawford. This is my home now." The statement took him aback. "Your home? Begging your pardon, but you don't exactly seem the type for homesteading, especially not alone." She turned to face him, chin raised slightly. "And what type would that be exactly?" Quentin shifted uncomfortably under her steady gaze. "Just meant, it's hard country, rough living. Winters that can freeze a man solid if he's not prepared. Not what most ladies from back east are looking for." "I'm not most ladies," she replied evenly. "And while I may have arrived from Boston, I wasn't born there. My father was a surveyor. We moved constantly throughout my childhood. I've lived in tents during blizzards and cabins during floods. I'm no stranger to rough living, as you put it." Quentin felt properly chastised, though she hadn't raised her voice or shown any sign of offense. "Fair enough. Still doesn't explain why you'd choose to settle way out here. Plenty of more established towns these days with proper amenities." Something flickered across her face, a shadow of something painful, quickly controlled. "I have my reasons, Mr. Crawford, just as I imagine you have yours for whatever circumstances have led you to your current situation." The pointed reference to his obvious decline wasn't lost on him. She'd seen through him in an instant, and the realization was both irritating and oddly refreshing. Most people in town had stopped seeing him altogether, looking past him as if he were already a ghost. "Touché, Miss Hayes," he conceded with a slight nod. "Your business is your own. Now, about these repairs, we should start with the roof before it rains again." They spent the morning taking inventory of everything that needed fixing, with Quentin making notes in her little book. Despite his initial reservations, he found Dahlia to be knowledgeable about construction needs, asking intelligent questions and making practical suggestions. By midday, they had a comprehensive list of materials required and tasks to be completed. "I can ride into town this afternoon and arrange for supplies," Dahlia said as they sat on the porch steps, sharing a simple lunch she had brought: bread, cheese, and apples. "How soon could you begin work?" Quentin considered the question. He hadn't committed to anything beyond this assessment, yet he found himself reluctant to walk away. "Could start on some of the smaller repairs tomorrow, I suppose. Clearing out the debris, fixing that door. Once the supplies arrive, we can tackle the roof." "We?" she questioned, one eyebrow raised. "Figure of speech," he corrected quickly. "I meant I could tackle the roof." Dahlia took a bite of apple, studying him. "Actually, Mr. Crawford, I was hoping to propose a more formal arrangement. I'd like to hire you to oversee the restoration of this property. With fair compensation, of course." The offer caught him off guard. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," she replied. "You understand construction. You arrived sober as promised, and despite your obvious reluctance to engage with people, you've been nothing but professional this morning." She paused. "And Sam Jenkins mentioned you were once quite respected in these parts." Quentin felt a flash of annoyance. "Jenkins talks too much. He also said you were the best man for this job, if you could stay away from the bottle long enough to do it." She met his gaze directly. "Can you?" The bluntness of her question should have angered him. Instead, he found himself considering it seriously. "Been sober since yesterday. Can't promise beyond today." "Then let's start with today," she said simply. "And tomorrow, we can decide about the day after." There was something in her approach, a lack of judgment or pity, that made it different from the attempts others had made to save him over the years. She wasn't offering redemption or demanding promises he couldn't keep. Just a job, one day at a time. "All right," he said finally. "But I work alone. Don't need any hired hands getting in the way." "Acceptable. With one condition, I'll be working alongside you." He shook his head. "This isn't ladies' work." "It's work that needs doing on my property," she countered. "I'm not afraid of blisters, Mr. Crawford, and I learn quickly. You'll find I can be quite useful." Something told him arguing would be futile. "Your hands, your choice," he muttered, "but don't expect me to go easy on account of your being a woman." The smile that crossed her face then was unexpected, bright and genuine, transforming her serious features. "I would be thoroughly disappointed if you did, Mr. Crawford." That smile did something strange to him, like a ray of sunlight penetrating a dark room that had been closed up for years. Uncomfortable with the feeling, he gathered their list and stood abruptly. "Best get those supplies ordered if we're starting tomorrow. Town's a fair ride from here." Dahlia nodded, collecting the remains of their lunch. "I should get settled at the boarding house as well. I'll return in the morning with whatever tools I can procure immediately." As they prepared to leave, Quentin found himself asking, "Where are your things? Didn't see much baggage with you." "Most of my possessions are being shipped from Boston. They should arrive within the month." She secured her saddlebag. "Until then, I'll manage with what I brought." He hesitated, then offered, "There's a widow in town, Martha Wilson. Good seamstress, fair prices. Might help you get some work clothes made up. What you're wearing is too fine for construction." Dahlia looked pleased by the practical suggestion. "Thank you. I'll seek her out today." They rode back toward town together, the silence between them surprisingly comfortable. At the edge of Dawson Creek, where their paths would diverge, Dahlia turned to him. "Until tomorrow, Mr. Crawford." He nodded. "Miss Hayes." As he watched her ride toward the center of town, Quentin felt oddly unsettled. For 3 years, he'd existed in a fog of grief and whiskey, wanting nothing more than to be left alone with his memories and guilt. Now, in the space of a day, he'd somehow agreed to a job that would force him back into the world of the living. The craving for a drink was strong, a familiar demon clawing at his insides. but for the first time in longer than he could remember, there was something else alongside it, a faint but persistent sense of purpose. That evening, as shadows lengthened across Dawson Creek, Quentin found himself standing outside the saloon, the familiar sounds of piano music and laughter spilling through its swinging doors. His body ached for the numbing comfort of whiskey, the blessed oblivion it promised. "Crawford!" called a voice behind him. It was Sheriff Taylor, approaching with his characteristic unhurried stride. "Thought you'd be inside by now, working on tomorrow's hangover." Quentin's hand tightened on his hat brim. "Not tonight." The sheriff's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That's so. Heard you took on a job with that Hayes woman. Didn't believe it myself." "Just helping fix up the Mercer place," Quentin muttered, uncomfortable with the attention. Sheriff Taylor studied him for a moment. "Well, good for you. Been too long since you did anything but drink and brood." His expression softened slightly. "Sarah wouldn't have wanted this for you, son. You know that." The mention of his wife's name sent a familiar pain through Quentin's chest. "Don't," he warned. The sheriff sighed. "Fair enough. Just saying. Might be good for you to have something productive to do." He tipped his hat and continued down the street, leaving Quentin alone with his thoughts. With one last glance at the saloon, Quentin turned and walked in the opposite direction. Tonight, at least, he would face his demons sober. Dawn arrived with a gentle golden light that belied the crisp autumn air. Quentin had been awake for hours, fighting the shakes and nausea that came with denying his body the alcohol it had come to expect. By the time he reached the Mercer place, he was sweating despite the morning chill, his mood as dark as a thundercloud. To his surprise, Dahlia was already there, dressed in a simple work skirt and blouse, her hair tied back with a practical ribbon. A wagon loaded with supplies stood in the yard. "You're early," he observed, dismounting stiffly. "As are you," she replied, looking up from the box she was unpacking. She paused, her eyes taking in his pallor and the slight tremor in his hands. To her credit, she made no comment about his obvious discomfort. "I've brought the initial supplies nails, some lumber, tools. The rest should arrive tomorrow." Quentin nodded, removing his coat despite the chill. Physical work would help distract him from the craving that gnawed at his insides. "Let's start by clearing out the inside. No point fixing the roof if the floor is going to give way under us." They worked steadily through the morning, removing rotted furniture and years of accumulated debris from the cabin. Dahlia proved as capable as she'd claimed, attacking each task with methodical determination. She didn't shy away from the dirtier aspects of the job, handling mouse nests and spider webs with the same pragmatic approach she applied to everything. By midday, Quentin's hands had steadied somewhat, though his head still pounded mercilessly. They paused for a brief meal, sitting on the newly cleared porch steps. "You're unwell," Dahlia stated matter-of-factly, passing him a canteen of water. Quentin took a long drink before answering. "It'll pass." "Withdrawal often does, with time," she said, her tone neutral. When he looked at her sharply, she added, "My father was a physician before becoming a surveyor. I'm familiar with the symptoms." "This arrangement won't work if you're going to preach at me," he warned. Dahlia shook her head. "I have no intention of preaching, Mr. Crawford. Your choices are your own. I'm merely acknowledging what we both know to be true." Her directness was both irritating and strangely refreshing. Most people either ignored his condition entirely or treated him with contemptuous pity. "Fair enough," he conceded. "And if we're going to be working together, might as well drop the Meister. Just Quentin will do." She smiled slightly. "Very well, Quentin. And you may call me Dahlia." The rest of the day passed in productive labor. They managed to remove all the debris, repair the worst of the floorboards, and rehang the front door on new hinges. It was basic work, but seeing the immediate improvement gave Quentin a satisfaction he hadn't experienced in years. As they were preparing to leave for the evening, Dahlia paused, looking out over the neglected land surrounding the cabin. What was this place like before? When Mr. Mercer lived here? Quentin followed her gaze, memories surfacing reluctantly. It was respectable. Nothing fancy, but well kept. Had a good vegetable garden there. He pointed to an overgrown patch near the creek. Kept some chickens, a milk cow. Benjamin wasn't much for ranching, but he got by. Why did he leave? Rheumatism got so bad he couldn't work the land anymore. Went back east to stay with family. Guess that would be your folks. Dahlia nodded. My mother was his sister. She passed 2 years ago, and Uncle Benjamin this past spring. In his will, he left this place to me. Her expression grew distant. He always spoke fondly of Colorado, said it was where he felt most free. Something in her tone caught Quentin's attention. And is that what you're looking for out here? Freedom? She met his gaze steadily. Among other things. The answer was evasive, but hinted at deeper reasons for her presence in Dawson Creek. Quentin recognized the look of someone running from something or toward something with an intensity he understood all too well. Well, he said finally, if it's a fresh start you're after, you've picked a good spot for it. Land's still good, despite the neglect. Creek doesn't run dry, even in summer. Could be something again, with enough work. That's what I'm counting on, she replied, a determined set to her jaw. Speaking of work, will you be able to continue tomorrow? The question carried an unspoken awareness of his struggle. Quentin considered lying, saying he felt fine, but something about her straightforward manner made pretense seem pointless. Won't be pleasant, he admitted, but I'll be here. She nodded, seemingly satisfied with his honesty. Until tomorrow, then. As Dahlia rode back toward town, Quentin remained at the property a while longer. The physical labor had been good for him, forcing his mind to focus on immediate tasks rather than dwelling in the past or craving oblivion. His body ached, but it was the clean pain of honest work, not the soul-deep agony he'd been drowning in whiskey for so long. Looking at the cabin, now at least cleared of debris and with a functioning door, he felt a strange parallel to his own situation. Like the Mercer place, he had once been something worth seeing, before neglect and disaster had reduced him to a hollow shell of his former self. The thought that either could be restored to something worthwhile seemed equally improbable. Yet, as he mounted his horse and headed back to his own dilapidated ranch, the image of Dahlia Hayes' determined face stayed with him, a woman facing insurmountable odds with nothing but resolve and hard work. It stirred something long dormant in his chest, a feeling he wasn't ready to name. The following weeks fell into a rhythm. Each morning, Quentin would arrive at the Mercer place to find Dahlia already at work, regardless of weather or difficulty. Together they tackled the most pressing repairs, replacing the roof, reinforcing walls, rebuilding the stone chimney, and sealing windows against the approaching winter. To Quentin's surprise, the work became more than just a job. Each completed task represented a small victory, not just for the homestead, but in his personal battle against the bottle. There were still nights when he succumbed to the craving, drinking until the demons quieted, but they grew fewer as the days passed. On mornings after such lapses, he would arrive shame-faced and sick, expecting judgment or disappointment. Instead, Dahlia would simply hand him a cup of strong coffee and direct him to whatever task required less precision that day. Her pragmatic acceptance of his flaws, without either condemnation or excuses, gradually allowed him to view his own failings with similar clarity. As October gave way to November, the cabin began to resemble a home again. New glass panes let in sunlight while keeping out the increasingly bitter wind. A repaired roof no longer leaked during the frequent autumn rains. The stone fireplace drew properly once more, filling the main room with warmth and the scent of pine smoke. The changes in the property were mirrored by subtle shifts in their relationship. Initial wariness gave way to cautious respect, then to a comfortable working partnership. Quentin found himself sharing occasional stories from his earlier years, cattle drives, the building of his own ranch, the community as it had been before the railroad came through. Dahlia proved an attentive listener, drawing him out with well-placed questions that never pushed too far into painful territory. In turn, she shared selective details about her own past, her childhood traveling with her surveyor father, Her mother's death from influenza, her brief experience teaching at a girls' school in Boston. But Quentin sensed there were significant parts of her story left untold, particularly regarding her decision to claim her uncle's remote property. "Never did explain why you came all this way," he remarked one afternoon as they installed the new cook stove that had finally arrived by freight wagon. "Most women I know would have sold the land rather than move to the middle of nowhere." Dahlia's hand stilled on the stovepipe she was holding. "Perhaps I'm not like most women you know." "That's obvious enough," he replied with a half-smile. "Still doesn't answer the question." She was quiet for so long, he thought she might not respond at all. When she did, her voice had a careful neutrality that contrasted with her usual directness. "I needed to leave Boston. When Uncle Benjamin's will arrived, offering this place, it seemed like Providence." She resumed her work, fitting the pipe sections together with precise movements. "Some situations don't allow for half measures, Quentin. Sometimes you need to put as much distance as possible between yourself and the past." The statement resonated with him more than she could know. Hadn't he tried to do the same after Sarah and the baby died? The difference was that Dahlia seemed determined to build something new, while he had only tried to forget. "Someone hurt you," he said quietly, not a question, but a recognition. Her eyes met his, surprise evident in them before her expression closed again. "We've all been hurt. It's what we do afterward that matters." Before he could respond, a gust of wind rattled the newly installed windows, and fat snowflakes began to fall outside. "First snow," Dahlia observed, moving to the window. "Earlier than I expected." Quentin joined her, watching as the flakes thickened rapidly, already beginning to accumulate on the ground. "Going to be a hard one by the look of it. Might want to stay in town tonight instead of trying to make it back." She shook her head. "I've already moved my things here. The bedroom is habitable now, and with the stove installed, I'll be warm enough." He frowned. "You've been sleeping here? Since when?" 3 days ago. The boarding house was becoming expensive, and most of the essential repairs are complete now." She smiled at his concerned expression. "I'm perfectly comfortable, Quentin, and I'd rather be in my own home, however humble it might be." The thought of her alone in the isolated cabin, especially as winter set in, bothered him more than it should have. "At least let me check your supplies before I go. Storm like this could last days." They took inventory of her provisions: flour, coffee, dried beans, cured meat, and a modest supply of firewood, enough to get by, but not with much margin for comfort. "I'll bring more firewood tomorrow," he promised as he prepared to leave, the snow now falling heavily. "And maybe see about getting you a proper woodshed built before the worst weather hits." Dahlia walked him to the door, a curious expression on her face. "You've done far more than our original agreement called for, you know." The essential repairs were completed last week. Quentin adjusted his hat, uncomfortable with the observation. "Job's not finished till you can get through winter proper. Besides, not like I've got pressing business elsewhere." "Nevertheless, I appreciate it." She hesitated, then added, "Be careful riding back in this weather." Something in her tone, genuine concern, perhaps caught him off guard. It had been so long since anyone had worried about his welfare that he hardly knew how to respond. "I know these trails blindfolded," he assured her. "Been riding them since before you were born, I'd wager." She laughed, the sound bright against the hushed backdrop of falling snow. "I'm 26, Quentin. Not quite the ingénue you seem to imagine." The information surprised him. He'd assumed she was younger, though he couldn't have said why. 26 made her only 6 years his junior, and somehow that realization shifted something subtle in his perception of her. "Even so," he replied, mounting his horse despite the animal's clear reluctance to leave the shelter of the porch overhang. "I'll be fine. Lock up tight behind me." As he rode away, the snow swirling around him, Quentin glanced back to see Dahlia still standing in the doorway, a solitary figure framed by the warm light spilling from within. The image stayed with him as he made his slow, careful way back to his own cold, empty cabin. That night, as the storm howled outside his window, Quentin lay awake thinking about Dahlia Hayes. What had driven her from Boston to this remote corner of Colorado? Who had hurt her badly enough to make her flee across a continent? And why did he increasingly find himself caring about the answers? The blizzard that began that evening continued for 3 days, blanketing the region in deep snow and effectively isolating outlying properties from town. Quentin spent the time alternating between worry about Dahlia's welfare and frustration at his own growing preoccupation with her. When the weather finally cleared enough for safe travel, he loaded a sledge with firewood and supplies and made his way to the Mercer place, telling himself he was simply fulfilling his promise, nothing more. He found Dahlia outside, determinedly clearing a path from the cabin to the well, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. She looked up at the sound of his approach, her face flushed from exertion and cold, and the smile that spread across her features sparked a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with physical exertion. "You made it through all right," he said by way of greeting, trying to mask his relief. "As did you," she replied, leaning on her shovel, "though I confess I was beginning to wonder if the storm would ever end." "Brought some extra supplies," he said, gesturing to the loaded sledge, "and that firewood I promised." Together, they unloaded the provisions, stacking the wood along the cabin's eastern wall where it would be sheltered from the prevailing wind. Inside, Quentin was pleased to see the stove providing steady heat and evidence that Dahlia had continued making improvements in his absence. Curtains hung at the windows, crafted from what appeared to be an old quilt, and she'd fashioned a passable table from crates and a salvaged door. "Place is looking more like home every day," he observed, removing his snow-covered coat. "It's coming along," she agreed, putting coffee on to boil. "Though I'm realizing there's much I didn't consider when I decided to homestead. Simple things become complicated in isolation." "That's frontier life," he said, accepting the cup she offered him. "Most who come out here don't last the first winter for that very reason. Not from freezing or starving, but from the 1,000 small challenges they never anticipated." Dahlia sat across from him at her makeshift table. "Is that why you believe I won't stay? Because I'm unprepared for the realities?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. "Didn't say that." "You've implied it since we met," she countered, not accusingly but matter-of-factly. "And perhaps you're right to doubt. I certainly had no idea what I was undertaking when I claimed this property." She looked around the modest cabin. "But I'm learning, and I intend to succeed." Quentin studied her over the rim of his coffee cup, the determination in her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw. Despite his initial skepticism, he was beginning to believe she might indeed have the fortitude to make it work. "Never said you wouldn't succeed," he clarified. "Just wondered why someone like you would choose this life when you had other options." "Someone like me?" she repeated, one eyebrow raised. "And what am I like exactly, in your estimation?" He shifted uncomfortably, regretting his choice of words. Educated, refined, the kind of woman who could have a comfortable life back east, with proper society and amenities. "Perhaps I've had enough of proper society," she replied, a hint of bitterness entering her voice. "Perhaps I prefer honest hardship to comfortable lies." The statement hung between them, revealing more than she had likely intended. Quentin recognized the pain underneath her words, not just disappointment, but betrayal of some kind. "Fair enough," he said quietly. "Wasn't judging, just curious." Dahlia's expression softened. "I know, and you've been nothing but helpful, despite your reservations." She hesitated, then added, "Actually, I wanted to discuss something with you. A proposition." "What kind of proposition?" he asked warily. "The land surrounding this cabin, it's more than I can manage alone, especially the pasture beyond the creek." Uncle Benjamin's letters mentioned that it was good grazing land. Quentin nodded. "Some of the best in the area. Too small for a large operation, but perfect for a modest herd." "That's what I thought," she continued. "I've been considering purchasing some cattle in the spring, but I lack the knowledge to manage them properly." She met his gaze directly. "I was hoping you might consider a partnership of sorts. Your expertise in exchange for a share of the profits." The offer took him completely by surprise. You want me to help you start a cattle operation? Is it so strange? You were a successful rancher once, from what I understand, and this land is going to waste as it stands." Quentin stood abruptly, moving to the window to stare out at the snow-covered landscape. The suggestion had stirred up memories he'd been avoiding, the pride he'd once taken in his herd, the satisfaction of building something from nothing, the future he and Sarah had planned together before it all turned to ash. "I haven't run cattle in 3 years," he said finally. "Lost my taste for it." Dahlia was quiet for a moment. "I understand loss can change a person's path," she said carefully, "but skills remain, even when desires fade. I'm simply suggesting a practical arrangement that could benefit us both." He turned back to face her. "Why me? Plenty of experienced ranchers around these parts who haven't spent the last 3 years drinking themselves stupid." "Perhaps," she acknowledged, "but you're the one who's already invested in this property's restoration, and despite your difficulties, I trust your judgment." She paused. "Besides, I suspect you need a purpose as much as I need a partner." Her perceptiveness was unsettling. Since Sarah's death, most people had either pitied him or written him off entirely. Dahlia seemed to do neither, instead seeing him as someone still capable of meaningful contribution despite his brokenness. "I'll think on it," he said finally, "not making any promises." She nodded, accepting his non-commitment. "That's all I ask." They spent the remainder of the day completing small repairs around the cabin, fixing a draft under the door, reinforcing a weak section of flooring, building proper shelves in the small pantry. As the early winter darkness fell, Quentin reluctantly prepared to leave, knowing the journey back would be treacherous in the dark. "You could stay," Dahlia suggested as he donned his coat. "There's the small room off the kitchen. It's cold, but better than risking the trail at night." The offer was practical, with no hint of impropriety, yet Quentin felt a strange tension at the thought of remaining under the same roof. "Best I get back," he replied. "Got animals to tend to." She accepted his decision without argument, but as he stepped onto the porch, she caught his arm lightly. "Quentin," she said, her expression earnest in the fading light, "thank you, not just for the supplies or the work, but for seeing me as capable rather than foolish for being here." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of mutual respect that transcended their working relationship. Without thinking, Quentin reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, the gesture surprisingly intimate. "You're many things, Dahlia Hayes," he said softly, "but foolish isn't one of them." Her eyes widened slightly at the touch, and for a heartbeat he thought she might pull away. Instead, she remained still, her gaze holding his with an intensity that made his breath catch. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities, until the distant howl of a wolf broke the spell. Quentin withdrew his hand, suddenly aware of how inappropriate the gesture had been. "Should get going before it gets any darker," he muttered, stepping back. Dahlia nodded, composing herself. "Of course. Be careful on the trail." As he rode away, the cold air biting at his exposed skin, Quentin tried to make sense of what had just transpired. The connection he'd felt with Dahlia in that moment had been more than physical attraction, though that element was undeniably present. It was a recognition of something kindred to people who understood loss and were trying, in their different ways, to rebuild from the ruins. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. For 3 years he'd existed in a state of suspended animation, neither fully living nor dying, just enduring one day at a time. The thought of caring about someone again, of having something to lose, made his chest constrict with anxiety. By the time he reached his own property, Quentin had convinced himself that the moment had been meaningless, a product of isolation and the intimate setting of the cabin as night fell. Dahlia was his employer, nothing more, and whatever spark he thought he'd felt between them was best ignored for both their sakes. Yet, as he tended to his few remaining livestock and prepared for another solitary night, he couldn't shake the memory of her eyes holding his, or the way something long dormant had stirred within him at her touch. The weeks leading up to Christmas brought increasing hardship as winter tightened its grip on the Colorado wilderness. Heavy snowfall made travel between properties difficult, and bitter cold tested the limits of even the most well-prepared homesteads. Yet despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, Quentin found himself spending more time at the Mercer place than his own neglected ranch. They fell into a comfortable routine. Most mornings, he would arrive with supplies or tools, and they would work together on various projects, building storage shelves, reinforcing the barn for future livestock, cutting and stacking firewood to last through the winter. In the afternoons, as daylight faded early, they would share simple meals by the warmth of the stove, talking of practical matters but occasionally venturing into more personal territory. Quentin learned that Dahlia had been engaged in Boston to a banker named Edward Harrington, but the arrangement had ended badly. She spoke of it with careful detachment, offering no details beyond the fact that she had discovered fundamental incompatibilities that made marriage impossible. Yet the shadows that crossed her face when the subject arose hinted at deeper wounds than her words acknowledged. In turn, he found himself gradually sharing pieces of his own past, how he'd come to Colorado as a young man with nothing but determination and a knack for handling cattle, how he'd built his ranch acre by acre, working for other ranchers until he could afford his own land, how he'd met Sarah when her wagon broke down during a spring storm and he'd helped repair a broken axle. She wasn't afraid of anything, he recalled one evening as they sat by the fire, the wind howling outside. First time I brought her to the ranch, it was nothing but a shack worse than this place and a few head of cattle. Most women would have run screaming back to town, but Sarah just rolled up her sleeves and started making plans for a garden. Dahlia smiled at the image. She sounds remarkable. She was, he agreed, the familiar ache in his chest tempered by the warmth of the memory. Always said she didn't marry me for what I had, but for what she knew I could build. And you did build it, Dahlia observed. Your ranch became one of the most successful in the area, from what I've heard. Quentin stared into the flames. For a time. Doesn't matter much now. Why not? She asked gently. The land is still there. It could be again, with effort. What's the point? The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. Built it all for her, for our future. Without her, it's just land and cattle. Dahlia was quiet for a long moment. I understand feeling that way, she said finally. After my mother died, my father lost all interest in his work. He'd been mapping new territories for years, but suddenly, the adventure he'd always loved seemed meaningless to him. She traced patterns on the wooden tabletop with her fingertip. He died 6 months later. The doctor called it pneumonia, but I always believed he simply lost the will to continue. I'm sorry, Quentin said, recognizing the pain of such a loss. She met his gaze. I tell you this not to compare our griefs, but because I've seen how loss can hollow a person from within. My father chose to follow my mother into death, in his way. But you're still here, Quentin, still breathing, still capable. Existing isn't the same as living, he countered. No, she agreed, it isn't. But perhaps the choice between merely existing and truly living is one we make daily, not just once. Her words stayed with him long after he'd returned to his own cabin that night. For 3 years he'd been trapped in a limbo of his own making, neither moving forward nor finding the courage to end his suffering permanently. Each day had been identical to the last, a gray blur of whiskey and regret, punctuated only by the physical reminders of his continuing existence: hunger, cold, the need for sleep. Since meeting Dahlia, those days had gained definition again. There were tasks to complete, problems to solve, conversations that stimulated his mind rather than numbing it. And increasingly, there were moments brief but undeniable when he found himself thinking of the future rather than the past. Christmas arrived with clear skies and temperatures cold enough to freeze breath in midair. Quentin had planned to spend the day as he had the previous 3 holidays, alone with a bottle, trying to blot out memories of happier times. Instead, he found himself saddling his horse early that morning, a rough-hewn wooden box tucked into his saddlebag. When he arrived at the Mercer place, smoke was already rising from the chimney, and the windows glowed with warm light against the pristine white landscape. Dahlia answered his knock with evident surprise. "Quentin, I didn't expect to see you today." He shifted uncomfortably on the porch. "Figured you might need help with something. Cold day to be alone." Her smile told him she recognized the excuse for what it was, but she welcomed him in without comment. The cabin's interior had been transformed with simple but effective touches of holiday cheer. Pine boughs arranged on the mantel, red berries in a jar on the table, and a small fir tree in the corner, decorated with paper stars and strings of dried berries. "You've been busy," he observed, removing his hat and coat. "Christmas was always important in my family, even when we were far from civilization," she explained. "My mother believed in creating beauty wherever we found ourselves." She gestured to the table where two places were set. "I was just about to have breakfast. Will you join me?" The invitation seemed to confirm she'd been hoping for company, despite her surprise at his arrival. They shared a simple but satisfying meal of cornbread and preserves, with coffee strong enough to ward off the morning chill. As they ate, Quentin found himself increasingly aware of the box in his saddlebag. The gift he'd made seemed foolish now, too personal, perhaps, or too presumptuous. Yet, when the meal was finished and a comfortable silence had settled between them, he found himself retrieving it anyway. "Got something for you," he said gruffly, placing the wooden box on the table between them. "Nothing fancy. Just thought you might have use for it." Dahlia looked genuinely touched by the gesture. "You didn't need to bring me anything." "Go on, open it," he urged, suddenly eager to see her reaction. She lifted the lid carefully to reveal a set of hand-carved wooden combs, their teeth fine and even, the handles decorated with simple but elegant floral patterns. "Quentin," she breathed, lifting one to examine it more closely. "Did you make these?" He nodded, unexpectedly pleased by her obvious appreciation. "Noticed you're always pushing your hair back when you work. Thought these might help keep it in place better than those pins you use." Dahlia traced the carved pattern with her fingertip. "They're beautiful. I had no idea you were so skilled with carving." "Used to whittle to pass the time on cattle drives," he explained, downplaying the hours of careful work each comb had required. "It's nothing special." "It's very special to me," she corrected, meeting his gaze with a warmth that made his chest tighten. "Thank you." She rose and moved to a small trunk in the corner, returning with a package wrapped in brown paper. "I have something for you as well, though it seems we had similar thoughts." Curious, Quentin unwrapped the gift to find a pair of leather gloves, clearly handmade, with his initials burned into the cuffs. "Your old ones are falling apart," Dahlia explained. "I noticed your hands were chapped from the cold. I'm not as skilled at leatherwork as you are at carving, but they should be serviceable." Quentin slipped them on, finding them a perfect fit. "How did you know my size?" she smiled. "I may have measured your old gloves when you weren't looking." The thought of her planning this gift, secretly taking measurements and working on it during her limited free time, affected him more deeply than he would have expected. It had been so long since anyone had considered his needs or comfort that the simple gesture felt profound. "Thank you," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Been a while since I had a Christmas gift." Something vulnerable crossed Dahlia's face. For me as well. The moment between them stretched, filled with unspoken feelings that neither seemed ready to articulate. Finally, Quentin cleared his throat. "Weather's supposed to hold for a few days. Thought I might ride into town tomorrow, pick up some supplies. Anything you need?" Dahlia seemed grateful for the return to practical matters. "Actually, yes, I was hoping to purchase some seeds for spring planting, if the mercantile has any left, and perhaps some fabric for curtains in the bedroom." "Make a list," he suggested. "I'll see what I can find." The remainder of Christmas Day passed in comfortable companionship. They took advantage of the clear weather to check fencing on the property's boundaries, then returned to the cabin as the short winter day faded into twilight. Dahlia prepared a modest but festive dinner, and they sat talking by the fire until the hour grew late. As Quentin prepared to leave, Dahlia walked him to the door, the new combs already arranged in her hair. In the soft glow of the oil lamp, her face seemed younger, unburdened by the worries that normally creased her brow. "Thank you for today," she said quietly. "It's been more than I expected." "For me too," he admitted. Something compelled him to add, "Sarah always loved Christmas, made a big fuss over it, even when we had next to nothing. After she died, I couldn't bear to acknowledge the day. Just another reminder of what I'd lost." He met Dahlia's gaze. Today was the first time it felt like something worth marking again. Dahlia's eyes softened with understanding. Grief changes how we experience everything, doesn't it? Even joy becomes painful because it reminds us of what's missing. She hesitated, then added, "But perhaps, over time, we learn to hold both the sorrow of loss and the possibility of new happiness." "Perhaps," he echoed, not entirely convinced but willing to consider it. As he stepped onto the porch, the cold air a shock after the cabin's warmth, Dahlia surprised him by rising on tiptoe to press a gentle kiss to his cheek. "Merry Christmas, Quentin," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. Before he could respond, she had retreated back inside, closing the door softly behind her. Quentin stood motionless for a moment, his hand unconsciously rising to touch the spot where her lips had been. The ride home through the moonlit snow should have been peaceful, but his mind was in turmoil. Dahlia's kiss, innocent though it was, had awakened feelings he'd thought long dead. Desire, yes, but also a tenderness that frightened him with its intensity. He'd spent 3 years building walls around his heart, and now hairline cracks were appearing in the fortifications, threatening the bitter but familiar safety of his isolation. By the time he reached his property, Quentin had convinced himself that he was overreacting. The kiss had been nothing more than a friendly gesture, appropriate to the holiday and their growing friendship. To read more into it would be foolish and potentially destructive to the working relationship they'd established. Yet, as he lay in his cold bed that night, sleep eluding him, he couldn't help but wonder if Dahlia had felt the same spark he had, the same dangerous, hopeful possibility that perhaps neither of them was as broken as they believed. The early months of 1879 brought periods of intense cold, interspersed with brief thaws that hinted at the coming spring. As February turned to March, subtle changes began to appear in the landscape, patches of bare ground emerging from beneath the snow, the first hardy crocus pushing through the frost, creeks swelling with meltwater from the mountains. At the Mercer place, the winter's work was bearing fruit. The cabin was now fully weatherproofed and functional, with additions that transformed it from mere shelter to a proper home. A stone-lined root cellar had been dug beneath the kitchen floor, a new chicken coop constructed in preparation for spring, and the barn repaired sufficiently to house the few animals Dahlia had acquired: a milk cow, 2 draft horses, and a small flock of chickens that a neighboring farmer had been willing to part with. To Quentin's surprise, he had found himself not just assisting with these projects, but increasingly taking ownership of them, offering suggestions and planning improvements without being asked. Somewhere along the way, his role had shifted from hired help to genuine partner in the homestead's development. More surprising still was his gradual return to sobriety. The transition hadn't been deliberate or announced no dramatic declarations or promises. Instead, the need for drink had simply receded as other priorities took its place. There were still bad nights when the memories became too intense, when he sought temporary oblivion in a bottle. But those occasions grew less frequent as winter progressed, and the paralyzing hangovers that once defined his mornings became rare rather than routine. Others had begun to notice the change. On his increasingly frequent trips to town for supplies, Quentin found himself being greeted with cautious respect rather than pity or contempt. Sheriff Taylor no longer felt the need to check that his gun was secured when they crossed paths. Sam Jenkins actually smiled when he entered the saloon to purchase tobacco rather than whiskey. "Heard you've been helping that Hayes woman get her place in order," remarked Wilson Cooper, the livery stable owner, one afternoon in early March. "Folks were taking bets on how long she'd last out there alone, but looks like she's proving them wrong." She's determined, Quentin replied, adjusting the saddle on his horse. Knows what she wants and isn't afraid of hard work to get it. Cooper studied him with knowing eyes. Seems to be having a good effect on you too, if you don't mind my saying so. Been a while since I've seen you standing straight and clear-eyed. Quentin shrugged uncomfortably. Just been busy is all. If you say so, Cooper grinned. Though I notice you're particular about getting her orders filled first whenever you come to town. And Martha Wilson says you've been asking her advice about fabric patterns, which doesn't strike me as typical Quentin Crawford behavior. The observation hit uncomfortably close to the truth. He had been taking special care with Dahlia's requests, often going out of his way to ensure she got exactly what she needed. And yes, he'd consulted the widow Wilson about suitable fabrics for curtains and table linens, enduring her knowing smiles and gentle teasing. Just being neighborly, Quentin muttered, mounting his horse. She's on her own out there. Course, Cooper agreed, though his expression remained skeptical. Neighborly, that's all it is. Quentin rode away, irritated by the conversation, but unable to deny its underlying implications. His feelings for Dahlia had indeed grown beyond mere neighborliness, though he'd been careful to keep them contained. Since that Christmas kiss, which had never been repeated or referenced by either of them, they had maintained a friendly but carefully proper relationship, never venturing into territory that might complicate their working partnership. Yet, Quentin was increasingly aware of how his day brightened when he arrived at her cabin and found her waiting on the porch, how he found excuses to extend his visits, how his thoughts turned to her during the hours they were apart. It was a dangerous path, one he'd sworn never to walk again after Sarah's death. Caring for someone meant vulnerability, and vulnerability inevitably led to pain. Still, as he rode the familiar trail back to the Mercer place, supplies secured in his saddlebags, he couldn't deny the anticipation that quickened his pulse at the thought of seeing Dahlia again. He found her in the newly fenced garden plot behind the cabin, turning over the soil in preparation for planting. She looked up at his approach, pushing back a strand of hair with the back of her hand, her face flushed from exertion. "You're back earlier than I expected," she called, setting aside her spade. "Did you find everything?" Quentin dismounted, leading his horse to the hitching post. "Most of it. Seed potatoes won't be in for another week, but I got the peas and beans you wanted and that special fertilizer Hawkins recommended." Dahlia's pleased smile warmed him more than it should have. "Wonderful. The soil here is decent but needs enrichment if we're to get a good yield the first season." The casual "we" didn't escape his notice. Over the winter months, their separate endeavors had gradually merged into a shared vision for the property's future. They now spoke of our garden, our livestock, our plans for expansion, though no formal partnership had ever been established beyond his occasional compensation for specific projects. "Got something else too," he added, reaching into his coat pocket. "Came on the stage yesterday." He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. Dahlia accepted it with surprise. "What's this?" "Open it and see," he suggested, enjoying her curiosity. She unwrapped the package to reveal a small book of poetry by Emily Dickinson. Her eyes widened as she carefully opened the cover. "Quentin," she breathed. "How did you know?" He shrugged, pleased by her reaction. "You mentioned once that you'd left your books behind in Boston. Said Dickinson was your favorite. Ordered it from Denver when I was in town last month." Dahlia looked up at him, her expression a complex mixture of delight and something deeper, more vulnerable. "This was incredibly thoughtful, thank you." "It's nothing," he said, suddenly self-conscious. "Just figured you might want something to read besides those farming almanacs." She clutched the book to her chest as if it were precious. "It's not nothing. Not to me." Their eyes held for a long moment, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Quentin found himself taking a step toward her, drawn by something he couldn't name and didn't want to resist. The moment was broken by the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats. They both turned to see a rider coming up the trail from town Sheriff Taylor on his bay gelding, moving at a pace that suggested official business rather than a social call. Quentin tensed instinctively. In his experience, unexpected visits from the law rarely brought good news. "Afternoon, Sheriff," he called as Taylor approached. "Something wrong?" The sheriff dismounted, nodding a greeting to them both. "Miss Hayes, Crawford. Sorry to disturb you, but there's a matter I thought you should know about." He removed his hat, a gesture that increased Quentin's unease. "Got a telegram from the marshal's office in Denver this morning. Seems they're looking for a woman matching your description, Miss Hayes." Dahlia went very still, her knuckles whitening where she gripped the book. "I see. And what interest would the marshal have in me?" Sheriff Taylor looked uncomfortable. "Telegram wasn't specific, just said they were inquiring after a woman named Dahlia Hayes, recently arrived from Boston, in connection with an ongoing investigation." "What kind of investigation?" Quentin demanded, moving protectively closer to Dahlia. "Didn't say. Just asked if anyone matching her description had settled in the area." The sheriff's gaze was sympathetic but firm. "Now, I haven't sent any reply yet. Figured I should speak with you first, Miss Hayes. Is there something I should know?" Dahlia's face had become a careful mask, betraying nothing of her thoughts. "I've broken no laws, Sheriff. I can assure you of that." "I believe you," Taylor replied. "But this telegram, coming from an official source, I'm obliged to respond somehow." "Of course," she said, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her posture. "And you should tell them the truth that Dahlia Hayes is indeed living at the former Mercer property, having legally inherited it from her uncle." The sheriff nodded slowly. "I can do that. But they're likely to send someone to speak with you directly once they know your location." "I understand," she squared her shoulders. "When they arrive, I'll be here." Sheriff Taylor seemed satisfied with her response, though his expression remained concerned. "All right then, I'll send that reply today." He replaced his hat. "If there's anything else I should know, anything that might help me understand what this is about." "There's nothing else," Dahlia said firmly. "But I appreciate your courtesy in coming to me first." After the sheriff had departed, a heavy silence fell between them. Quentin watched Dahlia, noting the rigid control with which she held herself, as if afraid that relaxing even slightly might cause her to shatter. "Want to tell me what that was really about?" he asked quietly. She turned away, moving toward the cabin with brisk steps. "There's nothing to tell. As I said to the sheriff, I've broken no laws." Quentin followed her inside, unwilling to let the matter drop. "Didn't say you had. But marshals don't typically send telegrams about law-abiding citizens without reason." Dahlia placed the book carefully on the table, her back to him. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully measured. "My former fiancé's father is a federal judge in Boston with considerable influence. I suspect this investigation is his attempt to locate me." "Why would a judge be looking for you?" Quentin pressed, sensing there was much more to the story than she was revealing. Her shoulders tensed. "Because his son is accustomed to getting what he wants, and I denied him that by breaking our engagement and leaving the city." Something in her tone, a brittleness that concealed deeper pain, stirred Quentin's protective instincts. "Did he hurt you?" he asked, the question gentle but direct. Dahlia was silent for so long he thought she might not answer. When she did, her voice was barely audible. "Yes, though not in ways that leave visible scars." Quentin closed the distance between them, turning her gently to face him. What he saw in her eyes, a combination of shame, fear, and defiance, made his chest ache. "Tell me," he urged softly. She took a shaky breath. Edward Harrington appeared to be everything a woman could want in a husband, wealthy, respected, charming, and public. "My father had just died. I was alone in a city where I had few connections, and Edward offered security and position." Her gaze dropped. "But in private, he was different, controlling, possessive. He monitored my correspondence, questioned my every movement, isolated me from the few friends I had." Quentin's hands clenched involuntarily. "Go on." "When I expressed doubts about our engagement, he became volatile. Never physical violence, but something almost worse, a kind of psychological cruelty designed to make me question my own judgment, my own worth. She wrapped her arms around herself as if seeking protection from the memory. He would rage, then become apologetic, promising to change. And I, fool that I was, believed him. Until the night I found evidence that I wasn't the first woman he had treated this way. "What happened?" Quentin asked, his voice gentle despite the anger building inside him. I confronted him. He denied everything, then became threatening when I insisted on ending our engagement. Said no one would believe me over him, that his father's influence would ensure I was ostracized from society if I spoke against him. A bitter smile crossed her face. He was right about that. When I returned his ring, rumors began circulating immediately that I was unstable, that I had engaged in inappropriate behavior with another man, that I was not of sound mind. "So you left," Quentin concluded. Dahlia nodded. When Uncle Benjamin's will arrived, offering this property, it seemed like providence, a chance to start over somewhere no one knew me, where Edward's influence couldn't reach. She looked up at him, vulnerability and determination mingling in her gaze. "I didn't run because I was guilty of anything, Quentin. I ran because staying meant either marrying a man who would destroy me piece by piece, or fighting a battle I couldn't win against a family with unlimited resources and influence." Quentin's heart ached for what she had endured, the betrayal, the isolation, the impossible choice she had faced. "And now they've found you." "It appears so," she acknowledged, her voice steadier now, "though I'm not certain what they hope to accomplish. I've broken no laws by ending an engagement and relocating." "Men like that don't need laws," Quentin said grimly. "They create their own rules and expect the world to follow them." Dahlia's expression hardened. "Well, I'm no longer playing by their rules. I've built something here, something real and honest. I won't abandon it because Edward Harrington's pride was wounded." Her courage in the face of such odds stirred something profound in Quentin's chest. Without thinking, he reached out to brush his knuckles gently against her cheek. "You won't face this alone," he promised. "Whatever comes, I'm with you." The simple declaration seemed to penetrate Dahlia's carefully maintained composure. Her eyes filled with tears, and she leaned into his touch, seeking comfort she had denied herself for too long. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you involve yourself in my troubles?" Quentin considered the question, searching for an answer that wouldn't reveal too much of the feelings he'd been guarding. "Because you saw value in me when no one else did," he said finally, "even when I couldn't see it myself." Dahlia's gaze met his, searching his face as if trying to read the truth behind his words. Whatever she found there seemed to resolve something within her. Slowly, deliberately, she rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. Unlike the chaste kiss on Christmas, this was no fleeting gesture of gratitude. It was tentative at first, a question being asked, but when Quentin responded, pulling her gently closer, it deepened into something neither of them had anticipated or been prepared for. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Quentin rested his forehead against hers, unwilling to move away completely. "Been wanting to do that since Christmas," he admitted quietly. A smile touched Dahlia's lips. "I've been hoping you would." The confession sent a rush of warmth through him. "Wasn't sure you felt the same. Thought maybe I was imagining things." "You weren't," she assured him, her hand coming to rest against his chest over his heart. "But I was afraid of complicating our working relationship, of opening myself to potential hurt again, of distracting us both from what needed to be done here." "And now?" he asked, suddenly uncertain. Dahlia's expression grew serious. "Now I realize that life is too uncertain to deny real connection when we find it. Whatever comes with this investigation, whatever challenges we face, I'd rather face them honestly, with you, than continue pretending my feelings don't exist." Quentin touched her face gently, still half disbelieving that this remarkable woman could care for him broken and damaged as he was. "I'm not the man I once was," he warned. "Might never be again. I don't want the man you once were, she replied simply. I want the man you are now, the one who keeps his promises, who creates beauty with his hands, who sees me clearly and stands beside me anyway. Her words struck him like physical blows, dismantling the barriers he'd built around his heart. For 3 years, he'd believed himself incapable of loving again, convinced that part of him had died with Sarah and their child. Yet, standing here with Dahlia, feeling her warmth against him, he recognized that his capacity for love hadn't died. It had merely been buried beneath layers of grief and guilt, waiting for someone brave enough to excavate it. Don't know what happens next, he admitted, with this Marshall business or with us. But I know I want to find out, if you're willing. Dahlia's answer was another kiss, softer than the first but no less meaningful. When they separated, her smile held a lightness he hadn't seen before, as if a burden had been lifted from her shoulders. I believe, she said, that whatever comes, we'll face it together. The weeks that followed brought a curious blend of tension and joy. Spring arrived in earnest, transforming the landscape with vibrant green and the first wildflowers dotting the hillsides. At the Mercer place, which locals had begun referring to as the Hayes homestead, preparations for the growing season proceeded with renewed energy. Quentin found himself spending most nights at the cabin now, sleeping in the small room off the kitchen that had been properly outfitted as a guest chamber. Though their relationship had deepened into something undeniably romantic, both he and Dahlia recognized the need for propriety, particularly with the shadow of the Marshal's inquiry hanging over them. No official had yet appeared to question Dahlia, but the knowledge that someone might arrive at any time created an undercurrent of anxiety beneath their daily activities. Quentin found himself growing increasingly protective, accompanying Dahlia whenever she ventured into town and keeping a watchful eye on strangers passing through the area. Despite these concerns, spring brought tangible progress to the homestead. The garden was fully planted, promising summer vegetables and fall harvest. The chicken coop housed a growing flock that provided eggs and would eventually offer meat. Most significantly, Quentin had negotiated the purchase of a small herd of cattle, 20 head to start, with potential for expansion as the operation proved successful. The day the cattle arrived, driven by a pair of cowboys Quentin had hired for the task, marked a turning point in his own journey. Standing on the hillside overlooking the pasture, watching the animals settle into their new range, he felt a sensation he had almost forgotten: pride in creation, in building something meaningful. They look right at home already, Dahlia observed, coming to stand beside him. She slipped her hand into his, a gesture that had become natural between them. You made a good choice with this breed, Quentin nodded, squeezing her hand gently. Hardy stock. They'll do well on this land. He glanced down at her, still sometimes startled by the affection he saw in her eyes when she looked at him. Might be time to think about branding. Can't run cattle without a proper brand. I've been considering that, she replied. What do you think about combining our initials, the H and C, together? The suggestion carried implications beyond the practical matter of marking livestock. A shared brand was typically created by families or formal business partners, people with a permanent connection to each other. You sure about that? He asked carefully. Combining our marks like that, people will talk. Dahlia's expression was serene. Let them. I'm not ashamed of what we're building together or of my feelings for you. She paused, then added more softly, unless you're having second thoughts. No, he said quickly, turning to face her fully. Not about you, never about you. He searched for words to explain the complexity of his emotions. Just sometimes wonder if you're settling for less than you deserve. Man with my history, my demons. She silenced him with a gentle touch to his lips. Quentin Crawford. I've known men with impeccable reputations and darkness in their souls, and I've known you, a man who has faced his demons honestly and chosen to fight them daily. Her eyes held his with unwavering certainty. There is no settling in choosing you, only recognition of genuine worth. Before he could respond, The sound of an approaching wagon drew their attention. Looking down the trail, they saw Sheriff Taylor driving a buggy, accompanied by a man in a dark suit whose rigid posture marked him as a stranger to frontier travel. "Looks like our visitor from back east has finally arrived," Quentin observed grimly. Dahlia's hand tightened in his. "So it seems. Whatever happens," he promised, "we face it together." She nodded, squaring her shoulders. "Together." They walked down to meet the approaching buggy, presenting a united front as Sheriff Taylor brought the vehicle to a halt before them. "Afternoon, Miss Hayes Crawford," the sheriff greeted them, his expression conveying both apology and concern. "This here is Marshal James Bennett from the Denver office. He's been sent to speak with you regarding that matter we discussed." The marshal was a trim man in his 40s, with sharp eyes that took in everything: the homestead's improvements, Quentin's protective stance, and particularly Dahlia's composed demeanor. He stepped down from the buggy with the careful movements of a man accustomed to city streets rather than rural paths. "Miss Hayes," he acknowledged with a nod, "I appreciate you agreeing to speak with me." "I wasn't aware I had a choice," Dahlia replied evenly, "but you're welcome nonetheless. Would you care to come inside? I can offer coffee." The marshal seemed slightly taken aback by her composure and hospitality. "That would be appreciated. Thank you." Inside the cabin, now transformed into a comfortable if modest home, they gathered around the table. Sheriff Taylor excused himself, saying he would wait outside to give them privacy, though Quentin suspected the man was simply uncomfortable with the tension in the room. "I'll be direct, Miss Hayes," Marshal Bennett began after accepting a cup of coffee. "I'm here regarding inquiries from authorities in Massachusetts concerning your departure from Boston last fall. Judge William Harrington has filed a formal complaint suggesting you left the city in possession of items belonging to his son." Dahlia's expression remained perfectly controlled. "What items would those be exactly?" The marshal consulted a notebook. "According to the complaint, family jewelry valued at approximately $500, given to you as engagement gifts." "I see," Dahlia said calmly. "And did this complaint mention that I returned all such items to Edward Harrington personally when I ended our engagement, or that I have written confirmation of that return, signed by Mr. Harrington himself?" This information clearly surprised the marshal. "No, it did not." "I thought not." Dahlia rose and moved to a small writing desk in the corner. From a drawer, she removed a folded document, which she handed to the marshal. "This is the receipt Mr. Harrington provided, acknowledging the return of all gifts and the termination of our engagement. You'll note it is dated prior to my departure from Boston." Marshal Bennett examined the document carefully, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "This appears to be in order, Miss Hayes. May I ask why you would keep such documentation?" "Because I anticipated that Edward, or more likely his father, might attempt something like this." Her voice remained steady, but Quentin could see the tension in her shoulders. "Judge Harrington was displeased when I ended the engagement. He made it clear there would be consequences." "And that's why you left Boston so abruptly?" "I left because I had inherited property that required my attention," she replied. "The timing was convenient, given the social difficulties that typically follow a broken engagement, but my departure was entirely legal and proper." The marshal studied her for a long moment. "Miss Hayes, speaking unofficially now, this complaint strikes me as unusual. Typically, property disputes of this nature are handled through civil courts, not federal marshals. The involvement of a federal judge as the complainant raises concerns about the use of influence." Quentin, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "Meaning Judge Harrington is using his position to harass Miss Hayes, and you know it?" Bennett didn't deny the accusation. "I can only speak to the facts as presented in the complaint. However, given this receipt and Miss Hayes's clear establishment here as a property owner, I see no basis for further investigation." He closed his notebook decisively. "I'll be reporting that the complaint appears unfounded based on documentary evidence. Relief washed over Dahlia's face, quickly controlled. "Thank you, Marshal. I appreciate your fairness in this matter." "Don't thank me yet," Bennett cautioned. "Judge Harrington is not a man who accepts defeat gracefully, from what I understand. This may not be the end of his efforts." "What more could he do?" Quentin demanded. "If the law's on her side—" "The law is a tool, Mr. Crawford," the Marshal interrupted. "In the right hands, it protects the innocent. In the wrong hands—" He left the implication hanging. "All I'm suggesting is that Miss Hayes should remain vigilant, and perhaps consider legal counsel of her own if further allegations arise." After the Marshal departed, accompanied by a visibly relieved Sheriff Taylor, Dahlia seemed to deflate, the composed facade crumbling as soon as the door closed behind them. "Hey," Quentin said gently, gathering her into his arms. "It's over. You did it." She leaned into his embrace, trembling slightly. "For now. But the Marshal is right, this won't be the end. Edward and his father aren't accustomed to losing." "Let them come," Quentin said fiercely. "Whatever they try next, we'll face it. Together, remember." Dahlia pulled back slightly to look up at him, her eyes searching his face. "I've been unfair to you, drawing you into my problems. This isn't your fight." "It became my fight the moment I fell in love with you," he replied, the declaration slipping out before he could consider its implications. Dahlia went very still in his arms. "What did you say?" Quentin felt a moment of panic, then surrendered to the truth he'd been avoiding for weeks. "I love you, Dahlia Hayes. Didn't plan to, tried my damnedest not to, but there it is." He took a deep breath. "Don't expect you to say it back. Just wanted you to know where I stand." Her response was to rise on tiptoe and kiss him with a passion that left no doubt as to her feelings. When they finally broke apart, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I love you too," she whispered. "Have for longer than I've been willing to admit, even to myself." The admission unlocked something in Quentin's chest, a final door he'd kept barred since Sarah's death. Loving Dahlia didn't diminish what he had shared with his first wife. Instead, it honored Sarah's memory by proving that the capacity for love she had nurtured in him had survived even the darkest grief. "Marry me," he said suddenly, surprising himself as much as her. "Not right away, if you're not ready, but someday, when you're sure." Dahlia's smile was radiant despite the tears now spilling down her cheeks. "I'm sure now," she said simply. "Yes, Quentin Crawford, I will marry you today, tomorrow, whenever you wish." He laughed, lifting her off her feet in a joyful embrace. "Let's do it proper. Get a ring, announce it to the town. Show everyone that what we're building here is permanent." As the sun set over the homestead that evening, casting long golden shadows across the land they had reclaimed from neglect, Quentin felt a peace he had believed forever lost to him. There would be challenges ahead: Harrington's vindictiveness, the ongoing work of building a successful ranch, the integration of their separate pasts into a shared future. But for the first time in 3 years, he faced the future with hope rather than dread, with purpose rather than emptiness. People had said Quentin Crawford couldn't love again after the tragedy that shattered his world. They had written him off as a broken man destined to drink himself into an early grave. Yet here he stood, his heart full, his mind clear, planning a future with a woman whose faith in him had rekindled his faith in himself. Dahlia Hayes had restored more than just the abandoned Mercer place. With patience, honesty, and finally that first brave kiss, she had restored a man who thought himself beyond redemption. And in doing so, she had found her own healing, her own place, in a world that had once seemed determined to deny her agency and worth. Together, they had built something neither could have created alone, not just a functioning homestead or a promising cattle operation, but a partnership founded on mutual respect and genuine love, the kind of love that recognizes broken places without being defined by them. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Quentin held Dahlia close on the porch of what would soon be their shared home. marveling at how the journey that had begun with reluctant charity had transformed into the second chance he'd never thought to deserve. "What are you thinking?" Dahlia asked softly, following his gaze to the emerging constellations above. "That some breaks can be mended," he replied, "if you find the right hands to do the mending." She smiled, understanding his meaning. "And some journeys end exactly where they're meant to, even when the path seems impossibly twisted." "This isn't an ending," he corrected gently, "just the beginning of something better than either of us imagined." As if to seal this promise, he lowered his lips to hers in a kiss that spoke of all they had overcome and all they had yet to build together. Quentin and Dahlia were married on a perfect June morning in 1879, with wildflowers carpeting the hills around the homestead and the scent of new growth carried on the gentle breeze. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, held on the property they had restored together, with Sheriff Taylor officiating and most of Dawson Creek's residents in attendance. Many of those same townspeople had once whispered that Quentin Crawford was beyond saving, that his grief had hollowed him beyond recovery. Now they watched in wonder as he stood tall and clear-eyed beside the woman who had accomplished what none of them believed possible, not by trying to fix him, but by recognizing his worth even when he couldn't see it himself. In the years that followed, the Hayes-Crawford Ranch, as it came to be known, honoring both their names, flourished under their combined care. The cattle operation expanded gradually, gaining a reputation for quality stock. The gardens and orchards Dahlia had envisioned became productive reality. A proper house was eventually built alongside the original cabin, which they preserved as a testament to their beginnings. Edward Harrington made one final attempt to trouble them, filing a civil suit claiming breach of promise that required Dahlia to travel to Denver for court proceedings. But armed with proper documentation and represented by a capable lawyer recommended by Marshall Bennett, she prevailed easily. The humiliating defeat, conducted in public view, finally convinced Judge Harrington to abandon his vendetta. In the spring of 1881, their first child was born, a daughter they named Sarah, honoring the woman whose memory Quentin now carried with pride rather than pain. A son followed 2 years later, named Benjamin, after the uncle whose unexpected bequest had changed the course of Dahlia's life. Occasionally, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the day's work complete, Quentin and Dahlia would sit on the porch of their home, watching the stars emerge over the land they had reclaimed from wilderness and neglect. In those moments, they would sometimes reflect on the unlikely path that had brought them together, a path marked by loss and pain for them both, yet ultimately leading to redemption neither had thought possible. "Do you ever think about how close we came to never finding this?" Dahlia asked one such evening, her head resting against his shoulder. "If Uncle Benjamin hadn't left me this property, if you hadn't offered to help that first day, if you hadn't been stubborn enough to see past what everyone else saw when they looked at me," Quentin added, his arm tightening around her, "sometimes I still wonder what you saw worth saving." Dahlia smiled, the years having softened but never diminished the love evident in her eyes when she looked at him. "I saw a man who kept his word even when it cost him, who created beauty with his hands even when he couldn't see beauty in himself, who stood beside me when it would have been easier to walk away." She touched his face gently. "I saw you, Quentin, not who you had been or what grief had made of you, but who you truly were beneath it all. And you," he murmured, "were brave enough to build something new when most would have surrendered to fear or bitterness. You fought for your freedom, your dignity. Never once let Harrington or anyone else define your worth." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of small feet on the wooden floor inside their daughter, awakened by a dream perhaps, seeking the comfort of her parents' presence. "Mama." "Papa," called Sarah's sleepy voice. "Are you outside?" "We're here, sweetheart," Dahlia answered, making room as the child climbed into her lap. "Couldn't sleep?" Sarah shook her head, her eyes so like her father's already growing heavy again now that she had found them. Wanted to see the stars with you." Quentin smiled, his heart full as he watched his wife cradle their daughter. The night sky spread vast and glittering above them. From deepest grief to this moment of simple, perfect contentment, a journey he would never have believed possible in those dark days after he lost his first family. Yet here he was, surrounded by love he had earned through daily choice and constant effort, blessed with a second chance he had never sought but now treasured beyond measure. People had said Quentin Crawford couldn't love again after tragedy shattered his world. They had been wrong. With a single kiss and unflagging faith, Dahlia Hayes had restored not just his capacity for love, but his belief in himself. Together, they had built a life that honored their separate pasts while creating a shared future neither could have imagined alone. As his daughter drifted back to sleep in Dahlia's arms and the first stars of evening deepened into the full splendor of night, Quentin knew with absolute certainty that some hearts, no matter how broken, were meant to be mended. And some loves, no matter how unexpected, were destined to heal not just the present wound, but all the scars that came before.